Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This, a new series called In the Shadow of Mount Sugarloaf, will be presented by Benita Parker from the West Wallsend District Heritage Group. Today, Benita will take us on a journey back to the earliest history of the West Wallsend District, where settlers first braved the untamed wilderness and nature's original residents, both human and animal, began their long shared story with the European newcomers. From the Awabakal people to the coal miners who transformed this land, the stories are vast and their legacies run deep.
Shh, listen. What you've just heard is one of the earliest inhabitants of this land in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf, the superb lyrebird. In that small sound clip, this clever mimic could be heard trilling its own mating call, but also that of the whipbird, a chainsaw, and a kookaburra. This beautiful bird has the fantastic ability to mimic almost any sound that can be heard by the human ear. The superb lyrebird inhabited these forested hills and valleys long before any human had set foot here. Other wildlife, seldom seen today, included the bandicoot, wallabies, possums and koalas, as well as birds such as emus, wrens, parrots, owls, finches, kingfishers, and 30 or 40 other species. In the tranquil valleys in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf, the arrival of the first Europeans gradually drove the natural flora and fauna, as well as the Awabakal people, the original settlers of this land, into the more rugged country to the west of the Sugarloaf Range, where they were seldom seen or heard. While there's no record of who named the mountain Sugarloaf, there are a number of mountains of this name worldwide, which are named for their conical shape. The name appears to be derived from Brazil, where sugar for export was shaped into conical mounds called sugar loaves. In Captain Cook's journal, he referred to it in these words: "In the latitude of 33.2 degrees south, a little way inland is a remarkable hill that is shaped like the crown of a hat, which we passed about 9 o'clock in the forenoon." The image of Mount Sugarloaf was first captured by Joseph Lycett, convict, forger, and artist in the early 1820s. His hundreds of paintings of the local areas he visited have given succeeding generations a glimpse of the Australian countryside as he saw it. His artwork can be seen online for those interested in his work. Mount Sugarloaf, which rises to a height of 413 metres and the valleys draining it, held a powerful secret hidden deep below its forested hills and valleys: black gold, coal. If you know about local history, you will be aware that Europeans came into the lower Hunter Valley to initially establish a penal colony for the worst convict offenders in Sydney. And then, soon after, they came to mine coal around Newcastle. Today, Lake Macquarie and its environments, which adjoin the Newcastle area, is an entirely different story. The Sugarloaf Range, drained by the Sugarloaf Valley, had a wonderful expanse of safe water with an exit to the ocean. Small communities grew up around the shores of Lake Macquarie as Europeans gathered in places like Dora Creek, Warners Bay, and a host of other tiny settlements. These villages became the entry and exit points for people using Lake Macquarie as a highway to their destinations. The first European to discover Lake Macquarie was Captain William Reid. In 1800, Reid sailed his 30-ton schooner Martha into the narrow entrance at what is now Swansea, mistaking it for his intended destination of the Hunter River. It was only when he returned to Sydney that Reid discovered his error. Until 1826, the lake was known as Reid's Mistake. Then it was officially changed to Lake Macquarie to honour Governor Lachlan Macquarie. Originally, a land around Lake Macquarie formed part of the huge land grants given by the government of the time as a reward for services to king and country. The area was shown on early maps, and still is today, identified as the county of Northumberland, parish of Terralba. When these earliest parish maps are examined, names such as James Runclord appear. On the 9th of February 1830, Captain James St John Runclord selected 914 acres in Terralba parish. This grant, which ran south from the Five Islands at the mouth of Cockle Creek to Marmong Creek, adjoined his first grant, which ran west to Killingworth and the Sugarloaf Range. Runclord's death led to the deed of his 914-acre grant being transferred on the 12th of March 1842 to James Mitchell of Sydney. However, these men didn't become permanent settlers, and much of the land away from the coast remained unsettled until the late 1850s. It wasn't until coal was being mined in Newcastle by the Australian Agricultural Company and, after 1847, by other companies which were set up specifically to mine coal in places like Hamilton, Lambton, Cardiff, Wallsend and Minmi, that European settlement started to appear. Men like Joseph Notley, Joseph Holmes, Richard O'Donnell, William Johnson, Duncan Cherry, James Lord and a few other men took up conditional purchases of land holdings varying in extent from 29 to 100 acres in the parish of Terralba. These more adventurous men saw that the Sugarloaf Valley may actually have that hidden treasure. At first sight, there wasn't much to attract men to this land in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. There were no rivers, so no water transport. There were several semi-permanent streams which drained small valleys falling down the slopes of the Sugarloaf Range into Cockle Creek and then into Lake Macquarie and out to the Pacific Ocean. Some of these creeks were called Sandy Creek, Burke's Creek, Slaty or Flaggy Creek, Cocked Hat Creek, Young Wallsend Creek, and Brush Creek, and formed an important part of the life of the early settlers in the 1860s, giving them access to fresh water for home and farm needs. Another difficulty with trying to settle in this area was the fact that it was all heavily timbered with blackbutt, ironbark, stringy bark, blue gum, spotted gum, and where the land was too swampy, there was thick tea tree brush. Clearing the land was a mammoth task when the only tools were the axe and the crosscut saw. This was the situation between the 1850s and 1860s when the first inroads were made by settlers into the lands in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. But our early settlers were a tenacious band, and although some left their land, many stayed and persevered. For the next 10 years, the early Sugar Valley settlers struggled to make a living from the land they had chosen. Many of these men turned to the functioning coal mines for a regular income at Wallsend and Minmi, or became timbermen cutting and hauling trees from the forest to the mines and sawmills where it was converted to pit props. This meant that their wives and large families survived in rough slab cottages hewn out of the dense bushland, doing much of the work to keep the family alive. There were no roads, no schools, no shops, just a need to be self-sufficient with what they could glean from their land and the surroundings. The life of the early settlers in the Australian bush is often glossed over and not given serious consideration. In the following podcasts, I hope to take you into the lives of two of these early settlers to experience the life and the hardships they faced. But for now, let me share with you some of the many sad stories of injury and loss of life experienced by these early settlers in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. Many miners died at an early age as the result of terrible conditions in which they worked, leaving their families to struggle in this harsh environment. But it was not only miners who sometimes met a tragic end. The following are just a few extracts taken from true reports in the newspapers of the day describing accidents, illness, and misfortune. The first account is taken from the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser on Saturday the 15th of March, 1862. An inquest was held by the district coroner on Sunday upon the body of a child named Joseph Notley, aged 4.5 years, who had died from the effects of a severe burning on the previous day. It appeared that the father, who resided at Bumbalong near Minmai, had lighted a fire at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning outside the hut for the purpose of burning an axe handle, and then went away with the mother to the stockyard to milk the cows, leaving the child and an infant inside. They'd only been gone a short time, however, when they heard the scream and, on the father running back to see what was the matter, he found the boy all in flames down on the fire. He was at once brought into the house and every attention paid to him, medical attention being sent for. Notwithstanding the exertions of the doctor, the child died at 11:30 o'clock on Saturday night. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Another account recorded in the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser on Thursday, the 30th of May, 1867, reads as follows. Sad occurrence. A sad accident happened at Trialba last week, which we deeply regret to say resulted in the death of a fine child named Mary Usher, aged 9 years. The child, we hear, was found in a water tank into which it is supposed she must have fallen by accident and, being unable to get out, got drowned. The deceased was noticed to go to a tank which had no cover on it, but she was not seen to come away from it again. An inquest was held on the body on Monday last, and after hearing all the evidence, the jury brought in a verdict of found drowned. The mother of this Mary Usher, who was drowned, is the wife of the poor man who recently died here from the effects of an accident in the pit. Much sympathy and commiseration has been expressed towards her in this, her last affliction. In a different newspaper called the Miners Advocate, a Northumberland Recorder, dated Wednesday the 19th of August 1874, there's this abridged report about William McGorry. Mrs. McGorry, mother of the deceased, deposed that on the 11th instant her little boy took very ill, vomiting and suffering from dysentery, and continued in this state till Saturday last. She sent her husband for the Wallsend doctor to come out and see the child. Dr. Clark gave her husband some powders to be taken by the child every few hours. On her husband's return, the child was worse, and they at once commenced with the powders as directed. 3 of the powders had been used, but the child continued to grow worse and died on Sunday morning. On Thursday, the 8th of June 1876, the Maitland Mercury reported this sad story. Information of a sad death from burning reached us from Wallsend late last evening, particulars of which we cannot give beyond the meagre fact of the fatal occurrence. A young lady named Elizabeth Nelson, aged 21 years, whose parents reside at Terralba, was accidentally burnt about 5 o'clock, and the injuries were of so serious a nature that she died shortly after. Mr. Nelson is a well-known settler at the locality of Terralba, and universal sympathy is expressed for the deceased lady's friends in their great affliction. On Tuesday, an inquest was held at the residence of the deceased's parents, when a verdict of death from burns accidentally received from her wearing apparel catching fire was returned. In the Newcastle Herald on Friday the 3rd of August 1877, an account of an unusual accident is recorded in these words. A curious accident occurred to the wife of Gilbert Ridley, a miner living at Terralba, on Saturday evening. She was thrown off a horse and received such a concussion of the brain as to render her perfectly blind, in which condition she remains up to the present. Her other faculties are scarcely at all impaired, but in addition she had her shoulder and side considerably bruised. And a final report in the Sydney Mail and New South Wales Advertiser on Saturday the 19th of January 1884 reads, County of Northumberland. Death has been unusually busy in the district during the past week. On Monday, a new arrival named Horatio Hart left the Minmi foundry where he had obtained employment to proceed to his wife and family near Terralba, but losing his way in the bush was found dead on Thursday morning, about halfway between Minmi and Wallsend. At the magisterial inquiry conducted by Dr. Nash, JP, it appears that the poor fellow only arrived in New South Wales on Christmas Day and came to Wallsend on Saturday the 5th with his wife and 4 children. He was noticed to be in a weak condition, but eventually got a job at the Minmi foundry, leaving his family at a farmhouse occupied by Mr. Rogers at Terralba. On the Monday, he started for home with 2 loaves of bread, but never reached his destination. The alarm was given on Tuesday to the police, but it was believed he would turn up during the day and no steps were taken to find him. On Wednesday, however, the alarm became general and search parties went out. The body of the poor fellow was found in an advanced stage of decomposition within a few yards of the thoroughfare. The case is a very sad one, but the miners of Minmi have maintained their reputation for kindness by taking the widow and children into the township and providing for their present wants. In conclusion, finding and settling in a new country and in a new home was not easy or simple for these early settlers in the 1860s in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. This land, like so much of the east coast of Australia, was prone to the vagrancies of nature. Floods, fires and drought were common. Floods such as the devastating flood in 1871, where a deluge of over 10 inches, that's equivalent to 400 mils, fell in a couple of days and wiped out many of the early settlers' improvements. This flood was followed by a drought which dragged on from 1875 to 1878, where the crops, starved of water, shrivelled and died. The drought left the country tinderbox dry and ready for the bushfires that raged between 1878 and 1879. Of course, life was not all about grief, tragedy and loss. These early settlers were strong in body, mind and spirit. They faced life's challenges on a day-to-day basis. The role of the men was to provide an income and thus food and shelter for their wives and children. The wife's role was to nurture and comfort her husband and children. In these times, large families were most common, with seldom less than 5 children and often as many as 15. As each child reached an age to help contribute to the family, they took on that responsibility, helping with domestic chores of caring for the younger children, working in the garden, hunting for wildlife to eke out the diet, and ultimately, as they reached teenage, to take on the tasks of adult life, boys to work in the mines and girls into service or marriage. Later, in another podcast, I will share with you the report written by a journalist who travelled through this locality in the mid-1870s. It gives a first-hand account of the country and the people he met on his journey. It is written in the language of the era and paints a moving picture of the country and its people. In the next episode, however, we will look at one of the first families to take up land and settle permanently in the parish of Terralba. We will meet Joseph and Thomasina Notley, their family, and life experiences in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf.
As we close today's episode, we've only scratched the surface of life in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. From the first settlers to the dramatic changes brought by coal mining, there are countless stories waiting to be told. Be sure to join us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.